Hello, welcome to the Self Learning Podcast by Dr. Sushma Singh. Let us start discussion on Chapter 4 Culture and Socialization. Culture, like society, is a term used frequently and sometimes vaguely. This chapter is meant to help us define it more precisely and to appreciate its different aspects. In everyday conversation, culture is confined to the arts or alludes to the way of life of certain classes or even countries. Sociologists and anthropologists study the social context within which culture exists. They take culture apart to try and understand the relations between its various aspects. Just like you need a map to navigate over unknown space or territory, you need culture to conduct or behave yourself in society. Culture is the common understanding which is learned and developed through social interaction with others in society. A common understanding within a group demarcates it from others and gives it an identity. But cultures are never finished products. They are always changing and evolving. Elements are constantly being added, deleted, expanded, shrunk, and rearranged. This makes cultures dynamic as functioning units. The capacity of individuals to develop a common understanding with others and to draw the same meanings from signs and symbols is what distinguishes humans from other animals. Creating meaning is a social virtue as we learn it in the company of others in family, group, and communities. We learn the use of tools and techniques as well as the non-material signs and symbols through interaction with family members, friends, and colleagues in different social settings. Much of this knowledge is systematically described and conveyed either orally or through books. For example, notice the interaction, how the words and facial expressions convey meanings in the conversation. This learning prepares us for carrying out our roles and responsibilities in society. You have already dealt with status and roles. What we learn in the family is primarily socialization, which happens in school and other institutions like secondary socialization. We shall discuss this in greater detail later in this chapter. Now let us move to the next point: diverse setting, different cultures. Human life in a variety of natural settings like in the mountains and plains, in forests and clear lands, in deserts and river valleys, in islands and mainlands. They also inhabit different social setup like in villages, towns, and cities. In different environments, people adapt different strategies to cope with the natural and social conditions. This leads to the emergence of diverse ways of life or cultures. Disparities in coping mechanisms were evident during the devastating tsunami of the 26th December 2004, which affected some parts of the Tamil Nadu and Kerala coast as well as Andaman and Nicobar Islands in India. People on the mainland and islands are integrated into a relatively modern way of life. The fisher folk and the service personnel in the islands were caught unaware and suffered large scale devastation and much loss of life. On the other hand, the primitive tribal communities in the islands, like the Onjis, Jarawars, Great Andamanis, or Shompenes, who had no access to modern science and technology, foresaw the calamity based on their experiential knowledge and saved themselves by moving on to higher grounds. This shows that having access to modern science and technology does not make modern cultures superior to the tribal cultures of the islands. Hence, cultures cannot be ranked but can be judged adequate or inadequate in terms of their ability to cope with the strains imposed by nature. Now, let us define culture. Often the term culture is used to refer to the acquiring of refined taste in classical music, dance forms, painting. This refined taste was thought to distinguish people from the uncultured masses, even concerning something we would today see as individual, like the preference for coffee over tea. By contrast, the sociologist looks at culture not as something that distinguishes individuals, but as a way of life in which all members of society participate. Every social organization develops a culture of its own. One early anthropological definition of culture comes from the British scholar Edward Tylor. Culture or civilization, taken in its wide ethnographic sense, is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. Two generations later, the founder of the functional school of anthropology, Bronislaw Malinowski of Poland, wrote, "Culture comprises inherited artifacts, goods, technical process, ideas, habits, and values." Clifford Geertz suggested that we look at human actions in the same way as we look at work in a book and see them as conveying a message. Man is an animal suspended in webs of significance he himself has spun. I take culture to be those webs. The search is not for a casual explanation, but for an interpretative one, that is, in search for meaning. Likewise, Leslie White had placed a comparable emphasis on culture as a means of adding meaning to objective reality, using the example of people regarding water from a particular source as holy. Do you notice anything in Malinowski's definition that is missing in Tyler's? Apart from his mention of art, all the things listed by Tyler are non-material. This is not because Tyler himself never looked at material culture. He was, in fact, a museum curator, and most of his anthropological writing was based on the examination of artifacts and tools from society across the world, which he had never visited. We can now see his definition of culture as an attempt to take into account its intangible and abstract dimensions so as to acquire a comprehensive understanding of the society he was studying. Malinowski happened to be stranded on an island in the Western Pacific during the First World War and discovered thereby the value of remaining for an extended period with the society one has studying. This led to the establishment of the tradition of field work. You will read about it in chapter 5. The multiple definitions of culture in anthropological studies led Alfred Kronberg and Cyril Kuchhon, anthropologists from the United States, to publish a comprehensive survey entitled Culture, a critical review of concepts and definitions in 1952. A sample of the various definitions is presented below. Try comparing these definitions to see which of these or which combination of these you find most satisfactory. You may first find yourself noticing words which recur: way, learn, and behavior. However, if you then look at how each is used, you may be struck by the shifts in emphasis. The first phrase refers to mental ways, but the second to the total ways of life. Definitions lay stress on culture as what is shared and passed on among a group and down the generations. The last two phrases are the first to refer to culture as the means of directing behavior. Make a list of phrases you have heard containing the word culture. Ask your friend and family what they mean by culture. What criteria do they use to distinguish among cultures? Now let us wind up the session, and thank you very much for engaging yourself with the Self Learning podcast.